Good morning and welcome back to Tiger's Great Journey Read Aloud. We are continuing our story. We are on chapter 8. This is called Able to Respond. And we are also going to be talking about the bridge of responsibility. Students, Sensei said, the black belt Shoka leadership trait we will be developing this week is responsibility. Here at Shotokan Karate Leadership Schools, we look at the root of the word responsibility and we see able to respond. With that thought, team leaders, please take a couple of minutes and discuss with your teammates the meaning of responsibility. Then prepare to share with the rest of us what you talked about. The students engaged in a lively discussion for several minutes. It went on a little longer than Sensei thought it would, but he could see that the teams were really getting into it, so he let it go. After some time had passed, Sensei called the class to order. Jerry, please tell us what your team was talking about, asked Sensei. Jerry was the team leader of the Velociraptors, a 3-person team that included Fabian and Kenji. Remember, Jerry, that when you speak, you are addressing the whole class and not just talking to me. Jerry stood up and took 2 steps towards the front of the room so that he could be seen and heard better by all the students. Jerry had studied responsibility before, and he knew that he was being responsible right now by putting himself in a position where he could be easily seen and heard. Sensei noticed this too and smiled inside, because when Jerry first came to Shotokan Karate Leadership School, he challenged everybody and was headed for trouble. Now here he was, not only acting responsibly, but about to lecture the class on responsibility. It was a transformation. We said that being responsible means being trustworthy and dependable, began Jerry. It means that people can count on you to do what you say you'll do and when you say you'll do it. It means that you're able to respond in a way that when you say you will. Thank you, Jerry. That was perfect, replied Sensei, as Jerry proudly turned and moved over to sit down with his team. Tiger, tell us what your team talked about. Tiger stood up and moved to where the other students could see and hear him and began. Taking responsibility for something means that you will make sure something will happen or won't happen. The reason we take responsibility so seriously here at Shotokan Karate Leadership Schools is because in self-defense, if you're not able to respond to an attack, you may be seriously hurt or end up dead. Excellent, Tiger, said Sensei as he sat down. And it's not enough, Sensei continued, to just know what responsibility means. We have to be responsible every day. Can someone give me an example of being responsible at home? Hands shot up. Sensei called on Sarah, who stood up and made sure she could be seen and heard. My mom wants me to look after my little sister when she has to run errands or do stuff. I like to do it, and my mom always thanks me and says I've been responsible when she comes home. And my little sister can be a real pain. All the students laughed. One more example, and then we'll start training, said Sensei. Hand shot up again, and this time Sensei called on Eric. Feeding my dog. My dad says I'm being responsible when I feed my dog, Eric answered. Eric, Sensei said, feeding your dog is another way to be responsible. Then Sensei called on Hireta, the class leader, to have the team spread out and get ready to practice. Hireta, in turn, told the team leaders to have their teams line up. She then walked back to where the shoes were lined up on the floor and picked up a pair of shoes that had been thrown down instead of put in their place. She called to the class, "Whose shoes are these? They need to be arranged properly." John, one of the new students, hurried over and, looking a little embarrassed, took his shoes from her and put them down neatly with the others. "Thank you," Hireta said simply, not wanting to call any more attention to him. Hireta then told the team leaders to perform an inspection. Each team leader examined their members' uniforms. A few students did not have their belts tied correctly. Others did not have the sleeves and cuffs rolled up properly. One new student, Jim, even had his pants on backwards. When the class heard this, they all laughed and laughed. Hireta asked them to quiet down and then said to Jim, "You are not the first person to put his pants on backwards, so don't let it bother you." And with that, she sent him to the changing room. After dinner and homework one evening, Tiger got out his Shoka Leader Handbook and began looking at the requirements for senior class leader. He had just earned his class leader rank and wanted to see what would be required of him to advance to the next level. He knew that he would be learning new skills and a new kata, and he was ready to go to work. Tiger felt that he was beginning to understand the responsibility that came with the knowledge and skills he was learning. He looked at the list of requirements and saw that some of them were repeats of previous requirements. He knew this because these were important and needed to be stressed over and over. The ones that were new to him, he read more carefully. One of the new requirements was to pick a school rule and explain it to his assistant school leader, how it might be interpreted differently by different people. As an assistant school leader had previously explained to the class that recognizing that people see things differently was an important part of being fair and would help others settle their differences. The next new requirement was to tell a story about how he used good manners to make others feel better. He knew good manners could make others feel better because the other day at his school, when he saw Sally struggling to get out a door with a heavy box, he opened it for her. She smiled at him and thanked him. He felt great about this, and so did Sally. He also knew that bad manners make others feel bad towards you because another time at school, Joey cut right in front of him at the drinking fountain and knocked him down. This made Tiger angry, and he wanted to shove Joey back. Another new requirement was for Tiger to show his assistant school leader that he was willing to help all the students in his class. He knew that this was part of being a responsible Shoka leader. There were some kids who were not well behaved and whom he'd rather ignore, but he had to figure out a way to support them too. Next on the list of requirements was the Black Belt Shoka leadership trait of cooperation. He'd have to convince the students in his class to work together. Some kids already could do this, but there were a few who were still figuring it out. He would also have to show his parents that he was becoming more of a leader by taking the lead in accomplishing a home project. He remembered his dad moaning about all the weeding that had to be done in the garden, so he thought weeding might be a good project to take on. One of the requirements was going to be very difficult. He knew what it meant to endeavor, but to endeavor in the face of 6 opponents attacking you at once would be really tough. But he was looking forward to learning and taking on this challenge. Another requirement was to read the Niju-kun and be prepared to talk about one of the 20 principles. He was to choose the principle that appealed to him the most. Tiger knew that Gichin Funakoshi was considered to be the father of modern-day karate and a great man. He also knew that Niju-kun was a important part of Gichin Funakashi's contribution to the world, so he wanted to give this the respect it deserved. He paged forward in the Shoka Leader Handbook and found the section on the Niju-kun and spent a few minutes reviewing it. He liked number 12, the one that said, "Do not cling to the idea of winning. It is the idea of losing that is not necessary." He thought about this and remembered that Sensei had talked about it recently. In defending yourself, you didn't have to beat up your attackers. You just had to not be beaten by them. He was also going to be required to tell his class the story of the wooden rooster and lead a discussion of the lessons contained in it. He loved to hear stories and wanted to be able to tell a good story, so now was his chance to learn. But he didn't know why storytelling, and in particular why the story of the wooden rooster was so important to a black belt Shoka leader. He made a mental note to ask his assistant school leader about this. Tiger would also need to lead a class in the conditioning exercises. He remembered how some of the kids had been complaining about doing these exercises and how hard they had been for him. He remembered how Sensei had stopped the class and asked them again if they wanted to be weak when they grew up or whether they wanted to be strong. Well, everyone wanted to be strong, and they all knew that to be strong, you had to do the things that were hard for you to do. They just didn't want to be reminded of that. But they relented and went to work. When they were finished, Sensei thanked everyone for being such good students. He said that it was a joy for him to teach them, and the class knew he really meant it because there was a sparkle in his eyes. The last requirements were the karate requirements. Tiger would have to perform basics, kata, and sparring. He was getting better at knowing the Japanese terms. Cajon, he had learned, meant basics. Kata was a series of movements against imaginary opponents. Kumite was an engagement with another student designed so that each student could improve. Often in Kumite, one student was the attacker and the other was the defender. The objective was for both people to pretend that they were deadly enemies and to attack and defend with spirit and vigor. It was clear that in reality they were partners who wanted to help each other improve as much as they wanted themselves to improve. All in all, working on these requirements was going to be challenging, but Tiger knew that once he had the skills he'd gained from completing these challenges, that he'd have taken another step forward to being the black belt Shoka leader who he wanted to be. And next, we're going to be reading about the Bridge of Responsibility. So we are continuing on the journey in Tiger's imagination with his friend Blake. And let's see what happens. The reason became clear as to why Tiger and Blake had to stay on the path they were on. There was an enormous river in front of them, blocking their path and extending as far as the eye could see in both directions. The water was running fast and deep. The boys knew that if they tried to swim across it, they would surely drown. But here was a bridge that spanned the water. They had done the right thing by staying on the path. This appeared to be the only way to leave the plains of endeavor and reach the chasm of cooperation, the next leg in their journey. Tiger and Blake started crossing the bridge. When they were halfway across, they suddenly stopped. A section of the bridge was missing. One of the supporting beams had broken off and the planks were missing. The remaining beam extended to the other side. Tiger and Blake looked down at the rushing water below and then looked at each other. They wondered whether they would be able to cross the remaining beam, but it was the only way to the other side. Tiger thought back to the day when he first asked his parents if he could take karate. They wanted him to be more responsible. They said they needed him to do his chores and his homework, practice, and go to class without complaining. And Sensei had said that responsibility was the ability to respond or to act in the way the situation required. Tiger had promised his parents that he would be responsible, so he asked himself how best to respond. What skills did this situation require? And he knew the answer to his own question: balance. Tiger remembered Sensei telling the class that karate required great balance and control. He had said that balance was a key ingredient for any endeavor to succeed, and that great balance was the balance of mind, body, and spirit. Sensei said, to balance your mind requires you to empty it of all negative thoughts and emotions and see clearly what you want to do and how you are going to do it. To balance your body requires you to take all the necessary steps that are needed to prepare your body for the endeavor. And to balance your spirit, Sensei had said, it is necessary to get your emotions in balance and to reaffirm your commitment to carry out your plan. While looking down at the rushing water far below, Tiger again heard in his head the voice of the old man who had given him the book of the empty mind. He still didn't know who this old man was, but he knew that what he had said was important. Empty your mind of all negative thoughts and emotions, the voice said to him now. See only what you want to have happen, prepare yourself, and bolster your spirit. Tiger turned and said to Blake, I know what we have to do. In our minds, we must block out the river and what could happen if we fell in. The log is what's important, not what could happen. We have walked on many logs that were on the ground and never fallen off. This log is just another log on the ground to walk across. Blake, do you know the story of the boastful champion? Blake said he didn't. Tiger said, there was a young boastful archer who could not calm his mind. He challenged an old master to an archery contest and made 2 incredible shots. The old master then brought him up to a mountaintop, walked out onto a shaky log over a deep canyon, and made a clean shot by hitting a tree on the other side of the ravine. The young man, who thought he was the better archer, couldn't calm himself enough to do the same. We have to calm our minds and be at peace inside. Then we will have the balance we need to cross. Okay, Blake agreed. What's your plan, Tiger? Tiger then described how he would go first because he had better balance. But just in case, the rope would be tied to Tiger's waist and anchored to the bridge. If he fell, the 2 of them could work together to get Tiger back up. Blake was strong and could hoist Tiger up, and Tiger could climb the rope and pull himself back up. He'd done it many times in the past when climbing into his cousin's treehouse. Then when Tiger got across the bridge, he would anchor the rope and Blake would cross. Tiger proceeded carefully. placing one foot in front of the other. He heard the rushing water below, but was not distracted by it. As he reached the middle of the log, a gust of wind picked up. He clenched the log with his feet and bent his knees and just barely avoided being tossed into the rushing water far below. He continued on, and when he was a few feet from the other side, he saw that the log was wet and mossy. Just as he noticed this, his foot slipped and he fell down into the river below. Now came the moment of truth. Would the rope hold? It did. Tiger's fall was stopped. He swung from the end of the rope about 15 feet under the bridge. Both boys went into action. Blake lay on his stomach and began to pull Tiger up. Meanwhile, Tiger climbed up the rope using his hands and feet. It was not easy, but together they made progress. Tiger got close enough to grab the bridge post and with Blake's help pulled himself back onto the bridge. They both rested for another try. When it was time to start again, Tiger decided that the safer way was to shimmy across the log rather than walk. Tiger lowered himself down onto the beam and slowly inched his way along. In a few minutes, he got across the broken part of the bridge and stood up. He then found a good place to anchor the rope and tied it off. Now it was Blake's turn. He looked scared. Tiger knew that he was responsible for his friend. He brought him along on this journey and didn't want anything bad to happen to him. I'll catch you, Blake, if you fall, just like you caught me. Blake took his first step onto the log and started to lose his balance. He caught himself and stepped back onto the safe part of the bridge. He looked at Tiger. Blake, why don't you shimmy across like I just did? Tiger suggested. Blake didn't want to do this because he thought it was the coward's way out. Tiger knew his friend well and figured that this was what he was thinking. Blake, be humble. Admit you have weaknesses. I'm not going to think any less of you. Blake looked over at Tiger. He realized that his friend was right, that he could trust him with his weaknesses. He also knew that this was an important part of teamwork, to be honest with each other about what you can and cannot do. Only then could the team function well. Without saying a word, Blake sat down on the log and easily shimmied his way across. When he got to the other side, he pulled himself off the log and smiled and said, "That was easy." They high-fived each other and whooped with joy. They continued to cross the remaining portion of the bridge. It was a lot longer than it appeared, but they finally approached the far bank of the river where the bridge came to an end. Looking ahead, they saw that the trail entered a large, deep, U-shaped valley that traveled up and away from the river. Tiger felt good. He had a better understanding of what it meant to be responsible. He knew that Blake had depended on him to get across the bridge, and he had depended on Blake. He took out the map and saw the word responsibility with the image of a belt tied in a square knot. He had expected to see something, he just didn't know what. Taking care of your uniform and making sure that your belt was tied correctly was one of the first responsibilities of a black belt Shoka leader. It started to get dark. The two boys were exhausted, but they found a good spot to camp, set up their tent, and crawled inside. They ate a little of what was left of their food and fell asleep happy that they were another day closer to their goal. Thank you for listening with us, and we'll see you next time on Tiger's Great Journey Read Aloud. Have a great day.